I just wanted to clarify a couple of things with a background stretch like this using a radial gradient. So you can see here I have a very short background, paper background with a lot of mess behind. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to fill in all of this background here with a color, and then we can adjust that using the mask afterwards. So we're going to make a new layer, and the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure my foreground color is a color, I like to choose the color that's quite light, nearest to her, nearest to your subject, and then the background color is the darkest that I want the corners to be. So I have my foreground and background color there, and I go into my gradient, which is the paint bucket and the gradient tool share an icon here. And then I'm going to make sure it's on radial gradient, but I'm also going to make sure that it's on the first one here, foreground to background. It has to be on that one, otherwise you won't see anything up to a 50% point. It'll just start gradually filling in with this color. So then I take from that point, from wherever I sampled my first color from, and up into the corner. So there we have it. It's all the picture has completely disappeared, and we can see a little bit of banding there. I don't know if you can see it on the video, but there is some there. So we're going to do a noise, and 1 or 2% is fine. So banding's gone now. I'm going to knock that off. I want to make sure that there's none of that gradient on her. So this is where I use my quick select tool, and it's on plus, and I just start dragging that over her. Oh sorry, you have to make sure that it's on the layer that you're selecting from, otherwise it doesn't do as good a job. Okay, so I select her, and I really have to go all the way to the outer edges of her. And then once I've done that, there's a little bit there, that should be alright there. I'll refine the edge with my normal settings, radius about 11 pixels, a little bit smooth. You can see it as it's happening here anyway, so you can mess around with those sliders. So we definitely don't want that in our gradient. So we're going to go back onto the gradient layer, click the visibility of it, hold down Alt, and then press the mask tool. Now obviously that's useless, it's far too hard a line around her, so we need to go onto our mask, and with black we can lower the opacity a bit, and we're going to start bringing back in the background. Oops, not too far so we see the edge there, we have to be careful of that, make it a little bit smaller. So now you can see that down here, if I go around her like that, we're starting to see a bit of a halo. We've got to merge that in. We don't want that very flat from top to bottom. We need to keep some of the shading that was there already to make it look, to ground her, to make it look like she was standing on something and not just sort of lying down on a grey background. So let's just have a look again. So we see some shading here, it's a little bit darker, we see some shading from her leg and on here. So I'm going to bring that back in again. I'm going to take up, make my brush bigger. It's at a 50% opacity, so I'll bring some of that back in. Okay, so that grounds it another little bit. So then at least we have, it stops it from being just too bland in the background there, and that's what that's for. But you've got to make sure that you are bringing in some of the original lighting, otherwise it's just going to look funny. Now once you have that, you can always click back on here and make bits of this gradient lighter or darker if you want. So if you wanted a little bit darker down here, then you can just click on that. I'm just going to click on that, find a slightly darker version of it, and with a low opacity brush, it's on 12% at the moment, just going to bring that in around. So you can always affect that colour, that gradient that you have there afterwards as well, just by clicking on it and painting. And because you've got this bit masked, you're not going to go back over your subject even if you paint over it like that. So that's something you have to be aware of. You can fill in all that missing area, but you've just got to make sure that that you're not just making it look completely unrealistic as well. It's always good to flick this on and off just to see which bits you need to bring back in as well. just so there's no chance that any part of the subject is covered by that gradient. So that's just a quick sort of clarification of how to use a radial gradient to stretch a background.